Dana White spoke publicly after UFC 326 and finally addressed the question everyone had been asking: why Conor McGregor is not part of the UFC White House card scheduled for June 14th. McGregor's absence from that event has sparked endless speculation, ranging from financial disagreements to scheduling complications. But behind the scenes, concerns related to anti-doping regulations and McGregor's current standing within the testing system appear to have played a larger role than many initially realized. The UFC has not fully laid out the details, yet the circumstances surrounding the situation help explain why McGregor's long-awaited return remains on hold. And in the process of answering questions, Dana White may have revealed more than he intended. To understand why McGregor missing this card carries so much weight, it helps to go back to the moment the UFC White House event first entered public conversation. The idea was introduced by President Donald Trump on July 3, 2025. During a rally at the Iowa State Fairgrounds, Trump stood before the crowd and described an ambitious plan: hosting a UFC event on the grounds of the White House with a crowd of around 20 to 25,000 people, featuring a championship fight and a full fight card as part of the celebration for America's 250th birthday. From the moment the announcement was made, one name immediately dominated the discussion: Conor McGregor. McGregor's return to the UFC had already been one of the sport's most anticipated storylines ever since he suffered a broken leg in his trilogy fight with Dustin Poirier in July 2021. At that point he had been inactive for nearly 4 years. Plans had been made for him to face Michael Chandler in June 2024, but that fight collapsed after McGregor suffered a toe injury during training, and the matchup was never officially rescheduled. So when talk of a White House event surfaced, McGregor quickly positioned himself at the center of the conversation. He did not simply express interest, he actively campaigned for the spot. Through interviews, social media posts, and public appearances, McGregor repeatedly stated that he intended to fight on that historic card. He even went as far as suggesting the fight was already in motion. In September 2025, McGregor appeared on Fox and Friends and confidently told viewers that he would be part of the event. On live television he said, "The Mac is excited to get back for sure. I'm on this card. This is me." He also revealed the opponent he had in mind: Michael Chandler. McGregor pointed out their shared history from coaching opposite each other on The Ultimate Fighter and noted the ongoing rivalry between them. Around that same period, Dana White was repeatedly asked about the potential main event for the White House card. When questioned about who topped his list, White gave a straightforward answer: Conor McGregor. In another interview he doubled down on that sentiment, saying, "Say what you will about Conor McGregor because people like to talk about that too, but he is that guy. He's always been that guy." By the fall of 2025, everything seemed perfectly aligned. The President of the United States had publicly announced a UFC event at the White House. The biggest draw in the history of the sport was openly declaring that he planned to fight on that card. And the UFC CEO was openly acknowledging that McGregor was the leading candidate to headline the event. It looked like the pieces were falling into place. In September 2025, Dana White also appeared on the Jim Rome Show and was asked directly whether McGregor could still perform at the level fans expected. White responded cautiously, saying, "We're going to find out." In another conversation around the same time, he even admitted that he had slightly more confidence in McGregor's reliability for the card than Jon Jones, noting that Jones sometimes created uncertainty around major bookings. At that stage the opportunity seemed wide open. McGregor reinforced the narrative by sharing footage of himself training in his gym in Ireland. The clips showed him hitting pads, moving around the cage and working through drills. Fans quickly circulated the videos across social media, and excitement grew rapidly. The story began to feel inevitable: Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, headlining a historic UFC event at the White House. But gradually the tone started to change. Dana White did not outright reject the idea of McGregor being on the card, but his responses became noticeably more cautious. Instead of highlighting McGregor as the centerpiece of the event, White began speaking in more neutral terms. He emphasized that he still had a good relationship with McGregor and said the final fight card would come together closer to February. That shift in tone was subtle but significant. White was no longer pushing McGregor's name as the obvious headline attraction. Instead, he seemed to be buying time and leaving room for other possibilities. Then, in March 2026, following UFC 326, Dana White finally addressed the situation more directly. But before examining what he said, it is important to understand another issue that has surrounded Conor McGregor for years: the anti-doping conversation. First, one thing should be made clear. Conor McGregor has never officially tested positive for a banned performance-enhancing substance. That remains a documented fact. However, the circumstances surrounding his status within the UFC's drug testing system have fueled ongoing debate within the MMA community. The story begins with his injury in 2021. After breaking his leg in the fight against Dustin Poirier, McGregor underwent surgery and eventually removed himself from the UFC's anti-doping testing pool while focusing on recovery and rehabilitation. Once a fighter leaves the testing pool, they are no longer subject to the random drug testing program. In simple terms, during that period they are not being tested by the anti-doping system. The trade-off is that when a fighter wants to compete again, they must re-enter the testing pool and remain there for at least 6 months while completing multiple clean tests before they are eligible to fight. McGregor remained outside that testing system for more than 2 years. And during that time, something else happened that caught the attention of fans, fighters, and analysts across the MMA world. Conor McGregor's physical transformation became impossible to ignore. The transformation became impossible to ignore. The fighter who once cut weight to compete at 145 pounds suddenly appeared significantly larger, with a frame that looked closer to that of a middleweight. His physique looked dramatically different from the McGregor fans had seen during his championship years. The visual change quickly sparked conversations across the MMA world, with fighters, analysts, and fans debating what exactly had happened. Joe Rogan was one of the most prominent voices to address it publicly. On his podcast, Rogan suggested that McGregor may have taken advantage of a loophole in the system while he was outside the testing pool. To explore the topic further, Rogan invited Derek from the More Plates More Dates channel, a creator known for analyzing athlete physiques and discussing the science behind performance-enhancing substances. Derek offered a blunt assessment of the situation. In his view, the circumstances created the perfect incentive. A fighter in his mid-30s attempting to return from a devastating leg injury might feel intense pressure to accelerate the recovery process and rebuild strength as quickly as possible. And visually, McGregor had never looked quite like this before. For many observers, the change simply did not pass what people in sports often call the eye test. The discussion was not limited to analysts and commentators. Several UFC fighters openly accused McGregor of using steroids, which only intensified the scrutiny surrounding his new physique. While none of those accusations were ever proven, the speculation continued to grow. Then a development occurred that would reshape the UFC's anti-doping landscape. According to an official statement from USADA, the relationship between the UFC and the agency eventually became untenable. The situation surrounding Conor McGregor played a major role in the breakdown between the two organizations. USADA maintained that McGregor should follow the standard rule applied to all returning fighters, re-entering the testing pool and completing 6 full months of clean testing before being allowed to compete again. McGregor, however, wanted a faster path back to the octagon. In November 2022, USADA publicly stated that granting McGregor an exemption from the 6-month requirement would not be appropriate. Dana White responded by suggesting that McGregor could still fight before the end of that year, hinting that the 6-month rule might not necessarily apply. During one interview, White delivered a comment that quickly spread across the MMA world. "Who cares what USADA says?" That remark captured the growing tension between the UFC and the anti-doping agency. Eventually, the conflict led to the end of their long-standing partnership. USADA had overseen the UFC's drug testing program since 2015, but the relationship officially ended soon after. In its place, the UFC introduced a new anti-doping framework known as Combat Sports Anti-Doping, or CSAD. Under the new system, McGregor faced another complication. CSAD later announced that Conor McGregor had accepted an 18-month period of ineligibility after violating the UFC's anti-doping policy. The violation stemmed from 3 missed biological sample collections within a 12-month window during 2024. The missed tests occurred on June 13, September 19, and September 20 of that year. Each incident was recorded as a whereabouts failure, which counts as a violation under the UFC's anti-doping rules. As a result, McGregor received an 18-month suspension that was applied retroactively beginning on September 20, 2024. That suspension is scheduled to conclude on March 20, 2026. And that date carries major significance. Technically, it means McGregor becomes eligible to compete again only a few months before the planned June 14 UFC event at the White House. But building one of the most symbolic events in UFC history around a fighter who had just completed an anti-doping suspension, on the lawn of the White House, with the President of the United States potentially present, introduces an obvious layer of complexity. None of these developments prove that McGregor ever used banned substances. But when viewed together, the sequence raises questions. The extended time spent outside the testing pool. The dramatic change in physical appearance. The public dispute between the UFC and USADA. The missed drug test. And finally, the 18-month suspension. All of those factors linger in the background whenever McGregor's return is discussed. So when Dana White ultimately made the decision regarding the White House card, those elements were almost certainly part of the calculation, even if they were never openly acknowledged. On March 7, 2026, the UFC hosted UFC 326 at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. During the broadcast, Dana White stepped forward to deliver a major announcement. The moment carried additional significance because the event aired on CBS. It marked the first UFC broadcast on the network since Paramount finalized its massive $7 billion partnership with the promotion earlier in the year. The broadcast represented the beginning of a new chapter for the UFC. And during that event, Dana White officially unveiled the fight card for the historic UFC White House show. The announcement caught many fans off guard. 12 fighters were confirmed for the event, yet neither Jon Jones nor Conor McGregor appeared on the list. Instead, the card is expected to be headlined by a UFC lightweight championship title unification bout between Ilia Topuria and Justin Gaethje. The co-main event is scheduled to feature an interim heavyweight championship clash between Alex Pereira and Cyril Gane. 4 additional matchups will complete the card. A bantamweight fight between Sean O'Malley and Ayman Zahabi. A lightweight bout between Mauricio Ruffi and Michael Chandler. A middleweight contest between Bo Nickel and Kyle Dawkhouse. And a featherweight matchup between Diego Lopez and Steve Garcia. But one detail immediately stood out. No Conor McGregor. No Jon Jones. The reaction from both the media and the fan base was immediate. Following UFC 326, Dana White addressed the absence of both fighters during the post-event press conference. When the conversation turned to Jon Jones, White was straightforward. He explained that Jones had never even been considered for the White House event. According to White, Jones is currently dealing with significant health problems, including arthritis in his hips. Doctors have reportedly warned that he may eventually require a hip replacement. However, when the topic shifted to Conor McGregor, White's tone noticeably changed. Instead of firmly closing the door on McGregor's return, White paused and chose his words carefully. Dana White explained that discussions are still ongoing about bringing the Irish superstar back into the octagon. However, he made it clear that the White House card simply was not the right fit for McGregor at this time. When asked about a possible timeline for McGregor's return, White revealed something that surprised many observers. The UFC is not even close to booking a fight for him. That statement carried real significance. Just 6 months earlier, when Dana White had been asked who he wanted to headline the White House event, he immediately named Conor McGregor. Now the message was very different. Instead of preparing for a major comeback fight, the promotion was not even near finalizing an opponent. Something clearly changed. Leading up to the official announcement, White had been operating with an unusual level of secrecy, even by the UFC standards. He revealed that the matchmaking team had been using temporary whiteboards during internal meetings. Potential fights would be written down, discussed, and then erased almost immediately in order to prevent leaks. According to White, the team had been working continuously on the card, adjusting matchups and refining the lineup right up until the last moment. In fact, one fight reportedly fell apart the night before the announcement was made. Despite that level of last-minute chaos, McGregor's name was never inserted as a replacement. That detail suggests something important. The decision to leave McGregor off the card was not a last-second adjustment. It appears to have been a deliberate choice made well in advance. Both Jon Jones and Conor McGregor had publicly expressed interest in fighting at the White House event after it was first announced. But based on Dana White's comments, McGregor does not appear to be anywhere close to returning to competition. White did not point to one specific reason for the situation. Instead, he described a broader set of circumstances, a situation with multiple layers. One of those layers may have nothing to do with drug testing, controversy, or reputation. It may simply come down to money. The UFC is expected to cover the entire cost of the White House event. That includes logistical expenses, security coordination, production costs, and even an estimated $700,000 required to restore the White House South Lawn after the event concludes. There will also be no traditional ticket sales. Reports in early 2026 indicated that taxpayer funding is not being used to stage the event. Instead, the UFC and its parent company are covering the expenses themselves. Initial comparisons placed the budget somewhere near the $21 million required to stage UFC 306 at the Sphere in Las Vegas back in 2024. However, newer estimates suggest the White House event could cost closer to $60 million. TKO President Mark Shapiro has already stated publicly that the event is not expected to generate a profit. The goal is simply to recover roughly half of the total cost through sponsorships, partnerships, and global media exposure. In other words, the UFC is knowingly accepting a financial loss. The event is about prestige rather than profit. It is meant to showcase the global growth of the sport and highlight how far the UFC has come as a brand. And that creates another complication when Conor McGregor enters the conversation. Because McGregor does not compete for standard pay. He fights for McGregor-level money. Reports have long indicated that his contract includes enormous guaranteed purses along with pay-per-view points that dramatically increase his earnings whenever he headlines a major event. For a show that is already expected to lose money, adding McGregor's financial structure could increase the risk even further. That leaves the UFC trying to balance spectacle, business realities, and public optics. Technically, McGregor becomes eligible to fight again shortly before the White House event takes place. But the combination of his anti-doping history, the uncertainty surrounding his comeback, and the financial structure of the card may have ultimately led the UFC to move forward without him. For now, the biggest star in UFC history remains on the outside looking in. Reports suggest that McGregor's contract includes purses worth tens of millions of dollars, combined with a financial model that only truly makes sense when attached to events capable of generating hundreds of millions in revenue. The White House card simply does not have that kind of economic structure. Attendance is expected to be capped at fewer than 5,000 invited guests. Tickets are not being sold publicly. And the event is not built around the traditional pay-per-view system that normally generates massive revenue for the promotion. Journalist Ariel Helwani discussed this exact issue on his show. He explained that the White House event is actually expected to lose money rather than generate profit. Because of that reality, placing McGregor on the card would only increase the financial deficit. In simple terms, the UFC would be paying its most expensive star to headline an event that is not designed to generate massive income. Interestingly, McGregor himself seemed to recognize that logic. In an interview before the official fight card was revealed, he explained that the UFC typically places him on events specifically designed to generate massive pay-per-view numbers. According to McGregor, a card like the White House show will attract global attention regardless of who is fighting. That creates a different strategic situation. Instead of using McGregor to sell an already historic event, the UFC could save him for another card where the financial structure better supports his pay model. And that brings the conversation directly to International Fight Week. International Fight Week in July traditionally features one of the biggest cards of the entire year. Pay-per-view events during International Fight Week traditionally feature packed arenas, global promotion, and the kind of revenue streams capable of supporting the massive paydays attached to Conor McGregor. By placing McGregor on that event instead, the UFC could effectively create two major headlines rather than one. The White House card becomes a historic spectacle on its own. And McGregor's comeback becomes a separate blockbuster moment just weeks later. But the clean business explanation does not appear to tell the entire story. If the decision were purely financial, Dana White likely would have said so directly. Instead, what fans witnessed was months of secrecy, carefully worded answers, and a gradual shift away from earlier statements where McGregor had been presented as the leading candidate for the event. That suggests the situation may be more complicated than simple economics. Adding to the speculation, McGregor recently stated that his eventual return will likely happen at welterweight. He openly acknowledged that his body has changed and that he is now significantly bigger than he was during much of his earlier career. That comment naturally brings the conversation back to the physical transformation that has been widely discussed over the past several years. A move to the welterweight division, one weight class above where McGregor spent most of his championship run, inevitably raises new questions about how his body has evolved during his long absence from competition. Even McGregor himself has admitted that the path back to the octagon remains uncertain. He revealed that his manager had been scheduled for meetings in Las Vegas to negotiate a fight. Yet despite McGregor's willingness to accept opponents and dates, no official agreement had been finalized. Which suggests the situation involves more than simple scheduling issues. Somewhere in the process there appears to be friction. Stepping back from the details, the bigger picture becomes even more intriguing. One ESPN analyst recently pointed out a striking pattern regarding the UFC's biggest mainstream stars. Conor McGregor, arguably the promotion's largest draw, has not fought in nearly 5 years. Another global name, Ronda Rousey, is no longer part of the promotion and now competes elsewhere. And Jon Jones, another superstar, reportedly was not even considered for the White House event. That observation raises broader questions about the UFC's position within the mainstream sports world. The White House event has been promoted as one of the most historic cards in the organization's history. Dana White has repeatedly described it as a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle and predicted that it could become the most watched UFC event ever. Yet the two names that casual sports fans recognize most immediately, Conor McGregor and Jon Jones, are not part of the lineup. The card still features strong and competitive fights. But according to some analysts, it may not fully match the enormous expectations that were created when the event was first announced. And at the center of that discussion sits the McGregor situation. Because when you follow the timeline closely, a clear pattern begins to appear. In September 2025, Dana White publicly identified Conor McGregor as the top candidate to headline the White House event. But only weeks later, the anti-doping suspension timeline became a major obstacle. McGregor was not scheduled to become eligible to compete again until March 20, 2026. That date placed his potential return only 3 months before the planned White House card in June. From that point forward, the UFC's messaging around McGregor began to quietly shift. By February 2026, reports began circulating that McGregor was unlikely to appear on the White House card. Then in March 2026, the official lineup was revealed, and McGregor's name was nowhere on it. During a recent appearance on Smashcast, McGregor admitted that missing the opportunity to fight Michael Chandler at the White House event was deeply disappointing for him. According to McGregor, the fight with Chandler had originally been the plan. But at some stage, the promotion began discussing different opponents and different dates. "I feel a bit weird about it," McGregor said while explaining the situation. That comment carries significance, because it suggests the fight once appeared certain, and then the direction suddenly changed. The word McGregor used was heartbreaking. That does not sound like someone who mutually agreed to sit out for strategic reasons. It sounds more like someone who expected the fight to happen, and then was told it would not. At the same time, another narrative began circulating inside the MMA world. UFC lightweight Mauricio Ruffi claimed that McGregor had actually been offered a fight on the White House card but declined when he was presented with a matchup against him, which leaves 3 different explanations circulating simultaneously. McGregor says the UFC moved away from him. A fighter on the card claims McGregor turned down a fight. And Dana White says the promotion is not even close to finalizing anything. 3 different versions of the story, all existing at the same time. But there are a few facts that are clear. Conor McGregor received an 18-month suspension under the UFC's anti-doping policy after missing multiple required biological sample collections. That suspension was applied retroactively to September 20, 2024 and officially expires on March 20, 2026. That date placed McGregor's eligibility only 3 months before the White House event. Technically, that meant he could have fought on the card. But the timeline was extremely tight, and the UFC ultimately decided not to take that path. Whether the decision was driven by financial concerns, the optics of placing a recently suspended fighter on a card at the White House, or other internal considerations remains unclear. What Dana White presented publicly was not a single explanation. Instead, it appeared to be a combination of factors. The financial structure of the event did not align with McGregor's contract. The anti-doping timeline introduced uncertainty. His physical transformation had already attracted significant public attention. And the secrecy surrounding the matchmaking process suggests discussions were happening behind closed doors that never reached the public. Despite not being part of the card, McGregor shared the official lineup on social media with a short caption. "Love it." Publicly he remained supportive. But the word heartbreaking tells a different story beneath the surface. The UFC White House event will take place on June 14, 2026 on the South Lawn. Ilia Topuria and Justin Gaethje will compete for the undisputed lightweight championship. Alex Pereira will attempt to capture a title in a 3rd weight class. And somewhere in Dublin, the biggest star in UFC history may be watching the historic night from the outside. For now, Dana White insists the door is not closed on Conor McGregor's return to the octagon. But the door to the White House event clearly is. And when all the pieces are placed together, the suspension timeline, the financial structure, the public optics, and the shifting statements from the UFC, the picture becomes far more complex than the simple explanations offered publicly. The real question may no longer be whether Conor McGregor will fight again. The real question is whether the full story behind his absence from one of the most historic events in UFC